Today's commencement talk is about you and me and our democracy. It's about our individual and collective responsibility for the future of this country and our world. And it's about answering the perennial question Antiochians have been asking for 17 decades. What would Horace say about education's role in democracy today? But first, let me pause. I recognize I am one of the privileged ones in this moment. I'm allowed to speak at a commencement ceremony. No one has disinvited me because they don't like my politics or they're worried about what I will say. Well, they might be worried, but no forces behind the scenes have canceled this event. In fact, Antioch has always been a home to cultivate rebellious voices, mine included, and for that, I am deeply appreciative. But it wasn't always that way. As an impassioned high school student in the late 1960s, I was literally barred from participating in my own graduation for organizing a student walkout in support of the Los Angeles teacher strike. And in my first year of college, I used words too loosely and wrote something inappropriate on an envelope that I then mailed to my parents, no less, and 2 FBI men showed up at my college dorm room. So for me, the voices of youth, idealistic, passionate, disconcerting, and sometimes unruly, are exactly what this world needs now. I much prefer to be dealing with unruly hearts than impenetrable hatreds. We're only on page 1, you guys. So I have the platform today. For those of you familiar with my annual commencement address, you know I meander for months and months, reading until a theme emerges as I prepare. This time was a bit different. Chancellor Groves called me late last year and said, "Laurien, I want to be sure that when we get to November 6th, I can say Antioch did everything it could to ensure our democracy. So come up with a plan." That's a dangerous thing to say to me. It turned into Antioch Works for Democracy, and Bill shared a little bit with you about that. I'm not going to go into it now. But it also, in some ways, turned into this commencement address. Not to be overly dramatic, but the search for ways to save democracy has saved me. It took me out of my profound despair at the state of this country and made me look at who I am, brokenhearted and all. It helped me reflect more deeply on higher education's role in strengthening our threatened and very fragile democracy. Maybe it's a road you've been on the past few months or few years. So please bear with me as we go on this little 20-minute journey together. And hopefully, as Antiochians, it may help us all. To start, the litany of what's wrong seems overwhelming. But this first part's going to be short because this is a celebration. So I'm going to focus specifically on the state of democracy. To do otherwise would feel absolutely tone deaf right now. The threats are not figments of our darkest imagination. A 2024 Pew Global Survey shows the depths of democratic recession worldwide. Over 60% of those surveyed in 24 countries indicate their dissatisfaction with their country's democracy. In over half of those countries, close to 30% actually think they need a strong leader without any parliamentary or legislative interference. And in the United States, some 15%, that's 50 million people, actually support military rule. It gets more terrifying. About 15% of the US electorate, again, close to 50 million, believe this country is ruled by satanic worshipers and pedophiles. And 30% of those registered in the Republican Party indicate that true patriots may have to resort to violence to save this country. To them, the insurrection on January 6th was a beautiful day. I don't know what's more frightening: random gun violence that makes mass shootings almost weekly occurrences, or calls for politically inspired bloodbaths that make politicians targets and civil war a terrifying possibility. It's hard to believe this is where we are. And I think we need to ask, what happened to that educated and informed populace that makes reasoned and reasonable decisions for the common good? That's the cornerstone of our democracy. So given Chancellor Grove's request and my distress, I sat out to read everything I could about the rise of authoritarianism and how democracies die. While explanations vary, in general, scholars tell us that authoritarianism appeals to people experiencing tremendous change, societal change, who feel they are losing out, and they blame some other as the perceived reason for their loss. In essence, when people divide, authoritarianism can conquer. When people come together, democracy can thrive. Democracy is way more than free and fair elections, although even that seems in question these days. It's about what we, the people, do together. And that depends on us being educated in and motivated by democratic values, the respect for difference, and how to engage in dialogue, debate, deliberate, and determine a path forward. Yet, and you see this every day, the more diverse we become, the more those in power want to hold on to it, and the more those who feel they have lost their privilege want to blame the other. Basically, the narrative goes like this: this country is no longer great because someone, angry feminists, or maybe they're called cat ladies now, ding! Invading migrants, woke professors, you name it. They've somehow perverted progress and reduced this nation to a shadow of its former self. Author Anne Applebaum calls this restorative nostalgia, precisely the sentiment that's fueling slogans like "Make America Great Again." We know what that's about. Just to be clear, there is nothing restorative about it. The great post-war political theorist Hannah Arendt tells us that that sense of loss, resentment, and isolation is the experience of furious individuals who feel they have nothing in common except their contempt for the other. How ironic. Listen to that. Their connection is based on loneliness, and their solidarity is based on hate. Arendt wrote that 70 years ago, and yes, times change, and they don't. So here we are today. It's really odd to consider loneliness in these terms, but think of it. Loneliness is reaching epic proportions in this country. In the context of today's speech, the phenomena of loneliness isn't just about the welfare of individual seniors or the well-being of isolated youth. It's an actual reflection of the crisis of our democracy. It is literally making us sick. An APA 2016 survey reported that 63% of Americans said the elections, this is 2016, said the elections were making them sick, and the future of the country was a significant source of stress in their lives. By 2018, that number had gone up to 75%. I won't even venture to imagine what it is right now. I feel it every day. It wakes me up most nights. So I so want to aspire to, when they go low, we go high. But you got it. The insanity of the arguments, the perversion of facts, and the violence embedded in their words and acts make me scream at the TV or just hide inside my Los Angeles bubble. Whether in community colleges, community centers, college classrooms, or university encampments, we no longer listen to each other. But here's the thing. Democracy depends on us being better than that. Dictators, or in our case, wannabe dictators, love to prey on people's isolation and fears because that makes us vulnerable to their manipulation and susceptible to scapegoating. Historians tell us that it is precisely dialogue and a sense of shared humanity that authoritarian leaders fear most. Bottom line, in order to diminish the threat of black boots marching on these streets in our country, we must find ways to care about each other. And I know that feels hard, but let's be clear. I don't mean being silent in the face of hate-filled speech or blatant threats to democracy. We must always confront those fearlessly. But I do mean going beyond dismissive name-calling and simplistic stereotypes. Bridging across divides is the only way we're going to be able to turn the tide of this world breaking apart. And we can't do it by yelling at each other or ignoring each other. So I think it's the only way we get to we the people. Each of us must do our part to nurture those better angels because it matters. We need to cultivate in ourselves to be the kinds of people a just and inclusive democracy require, which means we need to transform the ways we live and work. Easier said than done, I get that. But think about it. We need to become the kinds of people democracy needs. Schools and colleges have a central role in that becoming, and this is where Horace comes in. A number of recent articles have identified the great misalignment of higher education. You know what they're talking about? The mismatch between credentials colleges are offering and the needs of the job market. Let me be clear. I agree there is a profound misalignment. But for me, that misalignment goes to the very heart of education's responsibility to cultivate democratic persons who believe in pluralism, equity, facts, reasoned debate, separation of church of state, the rule of law, and so forth. That's what Horace believed, and that's why Antioch was founded. For me, well, let me say it this way. In my imaginary conversations with Horace over the last few months, one Antiochian to another, they went something like this. The misalignment is that the average undergraduate leaves school with a $40,000 debt, and 20 years later, they still owe half of it. Master's graduates, $80,000 debt. And PhD graduates, $135,000 debt. Put starkly, their outstanding lifelong debt is to a bank and not to democracy, and it should be the other way around. Thank you. The misalignment is that 82% of universities no longer include a U.S. history or civics course in their general ed requirement. The result is devastating for our democracy. Did you know the majority of college students recently surveyed could not even name the 3 branches of government? That's the misalignment. The misalignment is shuttering arts and humanities departments because they aren't considered positive contributors to the university's bottom line. Of course, the bottom line being referenced is tuition dollars needed to balance budgets. I know it's important, Bill. But Horace's bottom line was whole person learning needed for an expansive democracy. The misalignment is watching higher education be strangled by rabid state legislatures, congressional witch hunts, and zealous donor demands. Diversity, equity, belonging. That's not what's dividing this country. They're precisely the values an inclusive democracy needs. And yes, for me, the misalignment is sending armed police to break up boisterous and rowdy but largely peaceful protests on college campuses and silencing faculty who speak out in their scholarship and academic lives. Antioch was founded on the belief that education is democracy's best defense. Horace Mann argued that ignorance breeds monsters, and education is democracy's safety net, outside of which is darkness. He viewed colleges as sites to nurture pluralism and prepare us as educated persons who could act in mutual cooperation to lessen friction, introduce deeper sympathy, and develop wider understanding. Bottom line, it's where we become the people democracy needs. That's the alignment I'm talking about. Somewhere along the way, and we don't have time to go into it, the central purpose of colleges shifted from educating people for democratic lives in society to preparing them for economic lives in workplaces. Education became an instrument for this country's economic growth, but not an investment in its expansion as a democracy. The fact is, we need both. If schools are where we are supposed to develop the skills to engage in deliberative dialogue across identities and differences, the misalignment is staggering. More than half of Muslim and Jewish college students and a fifth of all college students surveyed in 2024 at 600 universities and colleges indicated that they felt unsafe on campus and feared personal danger. We are failing this democracy. If schools are where we're supposed to learn how to discern fact from fiction, truth from lies, boy, the misalignment is beyond frightening. According to a recent study, there has been a significant increase in college students who now believe that COVID was a hoax, the 2020 presidential election was rigged, and the Holocaust never happened. As Antiochians, we need to do our part to reverse that trend line, realigning education to revitalize this democracy and win those victories. That's what Horace would tell us. So, and this is getting to the last part, don't worry. What does this have to do with the Graduate School of Leadership and Change, you ask? It's an interesting question, which I've pondered for over 2 decades. Typically, civics education tends to focus on undergraduate service learning, volunteering, and communities. That's because the most common way we think about civic engagement is through volunteerism. Don't get me wrong, that's important. But it really doesn't match up with a graduate school. Our responsibility is to educate professionals to be the democratic beings this country needs. And in that sense, democratic engagement isn't something enacted outside of your office. It's what you do in your profession. I could use the term civic-minded professionalism, but I prefer democratic professionalism because it isn't just about being civically inclined. It's about rooting every professional action you do in the values and methods of democratic engagement, from your leadership style to your organizational strategies to efforts to reduce inequities in your professional domains. So aptly captured by one scholar, quote, "We are democratic professionals, not because we do democracy professionally, but because we do professionalism democratically." That's a good one, right? Okay, yes. Don't get me wrong. I want professionals to know their specializations, like doctors and lawyers and scientists and scholars. But at Antioch, it isn't enough. At Antioch, we educate for the professions and to challenge those professions. I'm quite taken with the notion of seeing one's profession as being both a fulfilling career and a democratic calling. I think you are too, after all. You came to Antioch's graduate school to study and practice leading change for a more just society. Whatever your workplace, classroom, newsroom, boardroom, I know you put your professional capabilities in the service of democracy. You ask, how do I know that? I, too, have been trained in data collection and in evidence-based analysis. First, think of our program's pedagogies for democratic practice. Start with being in cohorts of diverse learners, working through conflicts and finding common ground for the common good. That's about learning democratically. Think about your first-year ethical dilemmas essay as the opportunity to weigh professional conflicts from the lens of what's right and what's ethical. That's about thinking democratically. Think about your second-year change project, creating transformational efforts with engaged stakeholders as opposed to imposing strategic plans on compliant followers. That's about acting democratically. And think about your dissertations as the interrogation of inequities in your professional domains. And the implications you talked about in your chapter 6 are all about what can be done. That's about imagining democratic futures. But my evidence goes a little further, bear with me. In preparation for today's speech, I reached out to our alumni. Well, Les did. And I asked them, how do they enact democratic values in their workplace? I'm thrilled to share I received dozens of replies. As an aside, because I know you're curious, graduates from 17 cohorts responded. And if you want to know, the most responses came from cohort 6 members, not to be competitive or anything. But here are a few brief snapshots of what they said. Leadership must agree to a listening exercise at all levels in every consulting contract I do. Last week, I literally put 3 empty chairs out so people wouldn't forget the voices that weren't there. I approach everyone with radical candor and transparent accountability. I raise up the stories of people from the countries left behind. I question answers, not to cast aspersions, but rather to understand and synthesize. And the last one I'll share, I decenter the leader and celebrate differences in the collective. I could go on, but you get the drift. When asked, are Antioch professionals, our graduates, you, focused on listening, engaging in dialogue, ensuring diverse voices, questioning the status quo, limiting the power of the leader, and acting for the collective good? I think Horace would be pleased. I am. We, in fact, are educating our middle-aged, cross-sector, geographically dispersed, multiracial, multi-ethnic PhD students to become the professionals this democracy needs. Professionals who use their capabilities to create opportunities for meaningful participation, for building trust and belonging across our differences of identities, experiences, and interests. Professionals who use their skills to interrogate democratic practices and undemocratic consequences of the domains they enter, be those healthcare, education, business, government, nonprofit. Bottom line, it's all about educating for the professions and for the people, not one or the other. We desperately need both now, and here's why. One more page. We may educate leaders to run excellent healthcare facilities that have the skill to care for their communities. But if the general public doesn't care enough to protect one another, we will not be prepared for the next pandemic. We may educate leaders to manage community nonprofits, but if the societal conditions of loneliness and isolation do not change, we will continue to see the rise of suicides and addictions, no matter how good the clinic or how skilled the therapist. We may educate leaders for meaningful careers as college administrators, but if those we serve are driven by fear and ignorance, unable or unwilling to discern fact from fiction, then Project 2025 can demonize education and dismantle our democracy. That's why the aspiration of Antioch's professionalism is not only mastery of a specialization, but also the ability to empower those we serve to recognize that their flourishing as individuals takes place in community, not contempt for that community. That's what we do at Antioch. That's the great alignment I'm talking about. And as Antiochians, you're not off the hook, sorry to say, just because you finished your doctoral studies. No way. Going back to the question that started this commencement address, what would Horace say about our role in democracy today? I think he'd tell us, given the magnitude of the threats, perhaps like no other time since his own, that Antioch has an ever more urgent responsibility to educate democratic professionals who will use their capabilities and privileges to make a more just, a more inclusive, and a more democratic country and world. For over 170 years, Antioch has been and will continue to be the most uncommon school for the common good, and you, our graduates, are the professionals democracy needs now. There's one more thing that I want to ask of you in this room. The other day I came across an extraordinary quote by a feminist philosopher, Judith Butler. And she said, "They tell us that hope is an impossible demand. I say, then demand the impossible." So, for every PhD newly minted, an engaged scholar, a reflective leader, a democratic professional, a parent, a grandparent, a partner, a child, no, not a child, can't conclude that here, colleague, friend, and family, as a citizen of this country, vote. Our democracy depends on it. Thank you.